A search party stands at the edge of a jagged fissure in the Ozark Mountains in the spring of 1894. The men are quiet. They are looking down at a heavy hemp rope that has been tied around the trunk of a massive oak tree. The rope descends into absolute, suffocating darkness. 2 days earlier, a local prospector lowered himself into this newly opened hole, hoping to find a vein of lead ore. He never pulled the signal line to come up. Now, as the search party hauls the rope back to the surface, inch by heavy inch, they find that there is no man at the end of it. And the thick hemp has not been snapped by the weight of a fall. It has been cleanly cut. History is filled with places that have a reputation for making people disappear, but very few of those places have a written and oral record spanning hundreds of years, all pointing to the exact same unsettling conclusion. We are told that the ground beneath our feet is solid, mapped, and fully understood. We are taught that the age of discovery is over, and that the only remaining mysteries lie in deep space or at the bottom of the ocean. But beneath the rolling, forested hills of Missouri and Arkansas lies a world that shatters that comfort completely. For centuries, the indigenous people of this region warned that the earth here was not solid, but hollow, and that the deep caves were not empty. Decades later, a wave of industrial miners arrived, armed with black powder and iron tools, ready to conquer the landscape. They did not believe in old legends, but what they found in the dark, and what they documented in local reports that have since been buried in obscure archives, suggests that the warnings were never just folklore. We are going to look at what the indigenous traditions actually said about the world below, long before the first settler arrived. We will examine the forgotten newspaper accounts from the mining boom of the late 19th century, when men began vanishing into the hollow hills. We will weigh the modern geological explanations that attempt to dismiss these stories against the physical evidence found deep underground that science still struggles to explain. And we will try to understand what really happened in the dark. To understand the scale of what we are looking at, you first have to understand what the surface of this land hides. If you drive through the Ozarks today, you see a peaceful, endless expanse of dense oak and hickory forests, deep ravines, and winding rivers. It looks ancient, quiet, and perfectly normal. But the Ozarks are not true mountains. They are a deeply dissected plateau, a massive dome of limestone and dolomite that has been lifted up and then slowly eaten away from the inside out over hundreds of millions of years. This is what geologists call a karst landscape. It is a world of sinkholes, losing streams that vanish suddenly into the earth, and blind valleys that lead nowhere. Beneath the trees, the ground is quite literally rotting away, carved out by acidic rainwater until it resembles a rigid sponge. There are over 7,000 documented caves in Missouri alone, earning it the title of the Cave State. But those are just the ones we know about. Long before any surveyor tried to map this subterranean labyrinth, the Osage people understood the true nature of the landscape. They called themselves the children of the middle waters. To them, the universe was divided into 3 distinct realms. There was the sky, the surface of the earth, and the lower world. And in the Ozarks, the boundary between the surface and the lower world was dangerously thin. The Osage did not view caves merely as holes in the rock. They viewed them as active, breathing portals. And if you have ever stood near the mouth of an Ozark cave in the dead of summer, you know exactly why. Because the temperature deep underground remains a constant 55 degrees year-round, a natural barometric pressure exchange occurs. On a hot July day, a narrow cave entrance will physically exhale, blasting a steady, chilling wind into the surrounding forest. You can feel the breath of the earth from 50 yards away. In the winter, the reverse happens, and the cave inhales the freezing air. To the people who lived closely with this land, a breathing entity was a living entity. The oral traditions, passed down from generation to generation by the elders, spoke of the deep caves with a profound caution that had nothing to do with a simple fear of the dark. The stories warned of a presence below, sometimes described as ancient beings, sometimes as spiritual forces, but always with the same practical instruction. You do not venture deep into the hollow hills. You do not disturb the places where the rivers sink into the dark. And you certainly do not go looking for what lives in the absolute black. To us, sitting in brightly lit rooms, it is very easy to dismiss this as mythology. We like to think of people from the past as deeply superstitious, filling the unknown with imaginary monsters. But to people who relied on intense observation of the natural world to survive, this was not a fairy tale. It was practical knowledge, an oral map of danger zones, kept alive by voice because ignoring it carried a very real, very permanent cost. If you value this kind of history, the stories that live in the quiet spaces between the official records, consider subscribing to this channel because preserving these forgotten accounts is exactly what we do here. The indigenous traditions held this fragile balance for centuries. They lived on the surface, respected the breathing portals, and left the deep dark alone. But in the mid-19th century, the world changed. A new kind of people arrived in the Ozarks. They did not care about the balance of the three realms, and they did not listen to the stories of the elders. They were surveyors, prospectors, and pioneers, and they looked at the limestone bluffs and saw only one thing: wealth. The region was sitting on some of the richest deposits of lead and zinc in the world, and so the digging began. We are going to look at exactly what happened when the industrial age broke into the lower world, at the terrifying reports filed by the men who went down into the dark, at the physical evidence they claimed to have found, and at the reasons why the official narrative of the mining boom quietly erased these stories from the history books. Because years later, a completely different group of people arrived in these hills, and what they recorded should not have matched the ancient legends at all. But it did. By the 1880s, the tri-state mining district had become a chaotic, booming frontier. Towns sprang up overnight. The ground was being blown open with black powder, pickaxes, and steam drills. Men were sinking shafts hundreds of feet into the limestone, chasing veins of galena ore. But the Ozarks did not behave like normal mining country. In a normal mine, you dig through solid rock, creating your own tunnels. In the Ozarks, the miners quickly realized that nature had already done the digging. Often, a crew would be blasting a narrow shaft, only to have the floor suddenly give way, dropping them into massive, pre-existing natural voids. Imagine you are a miner in 1886. You are standing in a cramped, dusty shaft, breathing air thick with sulfur and sweat. You strike the floor with a heavy iron pick, and suddenly the rock crumbles. A rush of dead, freezing air blows up into your face, instantly extinguishing your lard oil lamp. When you finally get a light back on, you look down through the hole you just made. Your lantern beam does not hit a bottom. You drop a stone, and you wait. And you wait. And when it finally hits, the sound echoes with a vastness that tells you you are no longer in a small tunnel. You have just broken into the ceiling of a cavern so large it could swallow a cathedral. This happened constantly. The archives of local newspapers from the era, like the Springfield Daily Patriot or the various mining gazettes, are filled with small, easily overlooked columns reporting on these discoveries. At first, the tone of these articles is purely marvel. They talk of underground lakes crystal clear and perfectly still, of stalactites the size of ancient redwood trees, of entire subterranean rivers rushing through the dark. But as the 1890s approached, the tone of the reports began to shift. The marvel turned into a quiet, creeping dread. The disappearances began slowly. A lone prospector would head out into the hills to check a newly discovered sinkhole and never return to his camp. At first, this was easily explained. The terrain was incredibly treacherous. A man could slip, break his leg, and simply die of exposure. But then, the circumstances became stranger. According to a heavily circulated account from a regional paper in 1891, a group of 3 experienced surveyors entered a deep cavern system near the White River. They were well equipped, carrying hundreds of feet of rope, ample oil, and chalk to mark their path. They told their families they would be back by nightfall. They never emerged. When a search party of a dozen men went in after them 2 days later, they found a baffling scene. The chalk marks were clear and easy to follow, leading deep into the labyrinth. About 2 miles into the cave system, the search party found the surveyors' supplies. The heavy oil canisters, the extra ropes, their food rations, all neatly stacked on a flat shelf of rock. But there was no sign of the men. And more unsettling, there was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no collapsed ceiling, no deep pit they could have accidentally fallen into. The cave simply continued, winding deeper into the earth. The search party pushed forward for another mile, calling out, their voices swallowed by the oppressive silence. And then, according to the report filed by the search party leader, they found something that made them turn around and run for the surface. The report states that the men entered a massive chamber where the floor was covered in fine, undisturbed sand. And in that sand, leading away from the entrance and heading deeper into the unexplored black, were footprints. But they were not the heavy, hobnailed boot prints of the missing surveyors. They were bare, human footprints, hundreds of them, crisscrossing the sand in deliberate paths, and they were accompanied by the distinct, unmistakable remains of ancient fire pits, with soot staining the limestone ceiling high above. The search party realized, with absolute horror, that they were not the only ones walking through this mountain. Someone else was down there, someone who did not need lanterns. The men abandoned the search. The local authorities eventually declared the surveyors lost to a sudden underground flood, a common enough hazard in karst country. But the detail about the bare footprints and the fire pits remained burned into the local consciousness. And it was not an isolated incident. Mining records from that decade show a sudden, sharp increase in men refusing to work in certain deep shafts. Foremen complained of superstition stalling production. Miners reported hearing rhythmic sounds echoing through the limestone, sounds that did not match the random dripping of water. They described a cadence, like the striking of stone on stone, or the slow, rhythmic chanting of voices, echoing from tunnels that were supposedly completely unexplored. This is where the official history and the reality of the ground come into direct conflict. The mining companies needed investors, they needed labor, and they needed stability. You cannot run a profitable industrial operation if your workforce believes the ground is haunted by an ancient race. So, the strange reports were systematically dismissed. The disappearances were uniformly categorized as industrial accidents or desertions. The vast, anomalous caverns were either mined out and destroyed or deliberately sealed off with dynamite. The official narrative was locked in place. There was nothing down there but rock, water, and lead. But every time the authorities tried to close the book on the Hollow Hills, a new piece of evidence pulled it back open, and we have to look at what that evidence actually was, because it forces us to ask a very uncomfortable question. So, what is the rational explanation here? If you ask a modern geologist or a historian of the mining era, the answer is incredibly straightforward, and they have the science to back it up. They will tell you that the Ozark karst system is dangerous enough on its own without needing to invent underground dwellers. The entire region is heavily fractured. When rainwater falls, it mixes with carbon dioxide in the soil, creating a weak carbonic acid. Over millions of years, this acid seeps into the cracks, dissolving the limestone, creating an unimaginably complex network of voids, tubes, and massive rooms. When the miners of the 19th century broke into these systems, they were entering environments of extreme sensory deprivation. In absolute darkness, the human brain begins to panic. Without visual input, the auditory cortex goes into overdrive, trying to make sense of the silence. This is a well-documented psychological phenomenon called auditory pareidolia. The brain takes the random, echoing sound of water dripping miles away and forces it into a recognizable pattern. It turns a trickling stream into the sound of whispered voices. It turns the shifting of settling rocks into the sound of footsteps. According to the skeptical view, the terrified miners were simply hallucinating, their minds breaking under the weight of the dark and the toxic air, creating monsters out of nothing. As for the missing men, underground flash floods are a brutal reality. A rainstorm on the surface can take hours to filter down, suddenly filling a dry cave with a wall of violent, muddy water, sweeping explorers away without a trace, leaving their supplies sitting perfectly undisturbed on a higher ledge. It is a clean, logical, and highly comforting explanation. It tells us that the world behaves according to the laws of physics, and that the only enemy in the dark is our own imagination. But not everything fits so neatly into that box, because while psychology can explain the voices and hydrology can explain the floods, neither of them can explain the physical artifacts that were repeatedly found where they had absolutely no right to be. If the accounts from the search parties and the independent prospectors were just hallucinations, they would leave no physical trace. But throughout the early 20th century, independent cave explorers, the early pioneers of modern spelunking, began finding things that directly contradicted the official line. In the 1920s, an explorer named John Craig spent months mapping a deep, highly inaccessible cave system in the Boston Mountains region of the Ozarks. To reach the deeper chambers, he had to crawl through hundreds of feet of passageways so tight he could barely expand his chest to breathe. It was a place no casual traveler could ever reach. Yet, when Craig finally pushed through a narrow restriction into a massive, sealed dome room, he found that he was not the first one there. Resting on a limestone shelf, deep in a zone where natural light had not touched for millennia, were several long, carefully carved wooden torches, the ends charred black. Next to them were fragments of woven river cane, remnants of a basket or a sandal. This was not the debris of a 19th century miner. This was ancient. And this is the moment the whole case turns. Because if that detail is true, if someone was navigating miles deep into the absolute black using nothing but bundled river cane for light, then the official explanation is not just incomplete. It is fundamentally ignoring a massive piece of the human story. These discoveries were made quietly, often kept out of the main newspapers, shared only among the small community of serious cavers and local historians. They found more fire pits, deeply buried under layers of calcite that take centuries to form, proving the fires were ancient. They found walls where the clay had been deliberately smoothed and marked. They found places where the natural rock had been chipped away to widen a passage, not with steel tools, but with harder stones. Now, put it together. The Osage legend warned of a presence in the deep earth. The 19th century miners reported seeing footprints, hearing rhythmic sounds, and losing men in unexplained circumstances. And the physical explorers of the 20th century found actual, tangible proof of ancient human habitation miles deep into the cave systems. 3 sources across 3 different eras, coming from completely different worldviews, all pointing to the exact same impossible reality. Which leaves only 2 explanations. Either an extraordinary series of coincidences spanning centuries caused indigenous elders, hardened industrial miners, and modern cave explorers to all invent the exact same specific details, or the story was never a myth at all. Someone, or some group of people, really did master the deep underground. Everything now points in one direction. The legends, the reports, the artifacts, they all agree, but they also force us into a corner. We have to ask who these people were, how they could possibly survive in an environment devoid of sunlight, food, and breathable air, and most importantly, what happened to them when the modern world finally broke through the ceiling. This brings us to the single question this whole story has been building toward. What actually lived in the Hollow Hills? So here is what actually happened. Not the terrifying monster myth and not the dismissive official line, but the version that every single piece of evidence, both historical and physical, finally points to. The Osage legends and the miners' reports were never in conflict. They were describing the exact same reality from 2 ends of history. One was a warning, the other was a collision. What connected them was profoundly real, but it was not a supernatural race of subterranean dwellers. The physical evidence, the woven cane, the ancient torches, the footprints preserved in the undisturbed dust, belongs to some of the earliest human inhabitants of the North American continent. Anthropologists and archaeologists now know that during the Archaic period, thousands of years before the Osage formed their nation, ancient indigenous groups utilized the Ozark caves extensively, but they did not just shelter in the shallow entrances. For reasons we still do not fully understand, perhaps for spiritual rituals, perhaps mining for specific high-quality chert to make tools, these ancient people pushed incredibly deep into the dark zone. They navigated the labyrinth with burning bundles of river cane, leaving behind footprints, soot, and artifacts. Because the deep caves maintain a constant temperature and humidity, and because they are completely protected from wind, rain, and sunlight, they act as perfect geological time capsules. A footprint left in the deep dust of an Ozark cave 3,000 years ago looks exactly as fresh as a footprint left yesterday. A woven basket dropped on a ledge in the year 2000 BC will not rot. It simply waits. When the 19th century miners broke into these deep chambers with their steam drills and dynamite, they were not stepping into an empty geological void. They were stepping into a perfectly preserved museum of the ancient past. Imagine the absolute terror of a lone prospector, his mind already fraying from the sensory deprivation of the dark, lowering his lantern and seeing hundreds of fresh-looking bare human footprints in the sand. Imagine him finding a charred torch and a woven sandal that looks like it was dropped just hours ago. In the flickering, unreliable light of a lard oil lamp, surrounded by the crushing weight of the earth, he did not see an archaeological site. He saw an active, living threat. He ran for the surface, and he told everyone that there was a race of people living in the dark. The rhythmic sounds they heard, the chanting, the striking of stone, were almost certainly the auditory hallucinations of the cave environment, blending with the terrifying physical proof that humans had been there. The mind saw the footprints, and the brain provided the soundtrack. And what about the disappearances? The men who went down and never came back, the cut rope, the abandoned supplies. The caves themselves are the apex predator in this story. The Ozark karst system is unimaginably complex and deeply unstable. A man could crawl into a passage that looked perfectly safe, only to suffer a sudden collapse of unstable limestone behind him, sealing him in forever. And the flash floods, the silent, rising walls of water that surge up from the lower levels after a distant rainstorm, leave almost no trace. The cut rope from 1894? It was likely not cut by a knife, but sheared off by the immense pressure of a collapsing boulder shifting in the dark, severing the hemp against a sharp limestone edge. We cannot prove every last detail of every missing man. No one can at this distance in time, with records this fragmented. But of every explanation ever offered, this is the only one that leaves nothing unaccounted for. The legends were true. The deep earth was occupied. The miners were right. They did find footprints. And the geologists were right. The earth is a deadly, natural trap. And that means the Osage people who lived along those rivers were right all along. They were not superstitious. They were remembering. They knew that the deep caves held the echoes of an ancient people, and they knew that the earth itself was dangerous enough to swallow a man whole. They passed the warning down, keeping the memory alive, only to be ignored by an industrial age that thought it knew better. But the answer is not really where this story ends, because what it tells us about ourselves and about how we view the past is the part that lingers long after the geological explanations are settled. We like to think that history moves in a straight line, that we are always moving from ignorance to enlightenment, from superstition to hard science. We assume that when an ancient tradition tells us something impossible, they are simply making up stories to explain a world they did not understand. But the hollow hills of the Ozarks prove exactly the opposite. The people who lived there first understood the reality of the ground far better than the men with the steel drills and the mapping equipment. They understood that the earth is not a solid, conquerable thing, but a fragile, porous structure that keeps its own records. Those ancient footprints, preserved in the absolute dark for millennia, survived only because they were left alone. The moment the modern world broke through the ceiling, the delicate balance was destroyed. The air changed, the moisture levels shifted, and the relentless drive for lead and zinc erased countless ancient sites before anyone even realized what they were looking at. How much of our own human history has been ground into dust simply because someone was in a hurry to build a mine? Everything you know about the past exists only because someone, somewhere, chose to write it down, or chose to speak it aloud to the next generation. The moment they stop, it is gone. The caves of the Ozarks are a monument to exactly that fragility. They hold the silence of people who walked in the dark, left their marks, and vanished from the surface world's memory, only to become the monsters of a miner's nightmare centuries later. Remember that search party we started with? The men pulling the cleanly severed rope out of the dark fissure in the spring of 1894? Look at that image again now. It is no longer a story about a monster in the dark reaching up to cut a line. It is a story about a man who stepped out of his depth, ignoring the oldest warnings of the land, and was quietly, efficiently swallowed by the immense, indifferent geology of the earth itself. It is a warning that was right all along. So I want to ask you this. Is there a place where you grew up, a stretch of woods, a deep lake, an abandoned mine, where the locals lower their voices for no reason you can clearly see? A place with a warning that everyone knows but no one can prove? Tell me in the comments. I read them, and I genuinely want to know what stories are still breathing out there. I really do want to hear your answer to that, because the comments under these videos, the shared memories of strange local history, are half the reason I make them. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, the ones the history books quietly skipped over, then subscribe. That is the only way you will catch the next one, and there are far stranger ones coming. If it kept you here to the end, a like genuinely helps more people find this channel. That is not a small thing. It is the whole reason independent historical research like this survives. Thank you for staying with me all the way through the dark. Keep asking why the quiet places are quiet. I will see you in the next one.